Hi, it's Pastor Phil, and it's Thursday, and I'm doing a follow-up video from my message last week. If you were at LifePoint, I preached from the passage 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17, which is all about submitting to the authority of human institutions, including our government. And I hope that was a helpful message for you. It certainly was helpful for me as I was writing it and sorting through and learning some stuff. I learned a bunch of things that were helpful for me as a believer in America. But what I pointed out was the context or the theme of submission isn't just focused in those few verses about submitting to the government. There's actually a section about servants submitting to masters and wives submitting to husbands. But since our political culture is so chaotic right now, I focused most on those first passages. But I said I would come back and record a sort of follow-up video. So that's what I'm doing. This is the second of the three sections. This one's talking about submitting servants to their masters. Let me just read the passage for you. This is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. It says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust, for this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly." So let me get this out of the way first. Whenever you're talking about servants and masters, it's a really dicey topic, and it can be very emotional and potentially divisive because in America, when we think of servants and masters, we almost automatically associate that with a racial-based form of slavery, which is a terrible part of our American history. However, Peter is writing this in the mid-60s AD, so the first century. And what you need to realize is that slavery and servanthood was a normal part of the culture. Now, because he's writing to servants, this doesn't mean that he's condoning slavery. Actually, he's just reacting to the reality of this first century world. The people that he would have been writing to that are spread all across what is now modern Turkey, who are part of the Roman province, many of them might have been servants or slaves. And so he has a message for them that's just like the message he had previously when it comes to submitting to the authoritarian government. He says, servants, you should submit to your masters as well. Now that's a challenge, isn't it? Because we feel like, well, first of all, it's not right. There shouldn't be, people who are slaves, and I agree with you. The one thing to notice here, though, is most of who he's writing to is most likely a different level of servant. He uses a different Greek word than is typically used in the Bible for servant, or for slave or for bondservant. So instead of the word doulos, which is the Greek word for bondservant, he uses the word okete. And it's sort of maybe one level up. Most likely the servants he's talking to are getting paid or they're working towards their freedom. So rather than you and I picturing sort of a roots situation or a southern racial-based version of slavery, it's important maybe to visualize something closer to Downton Abbey or something. There is a class system here that's happening for sure. And again, Peter writing into this system isn't condoning it or condemning it. He's simply acknowledging that some of his readers are very likely servants. Now remember the point of this whole submission passage. The point of the whole thing is that people will see how they live, how these Christians lived in the first century. And when they see Christians living these peaceable lives and not reacting to their government authorities or trying to overthrow the government or trying to escape their masters or rise up against them, they're going to see a Christ-like example. And that's what Peter is really most interested in. Because in the first century here, the Romans hated Christians. And so Peter is saying, look, live this life so that when people see you and revile you, they will be put to shame. They'll look foolish for thinking that you're anything but a peace-loving individual. All right, so that's important. And then he goes on to associate the suffering that the servants may have from an unjust master with the suffering that Jesus encountered through his righteousness. He writes about it here. He says, For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. So the idea is, when Jesus suffered for the sake of all of us, he could have returned insult for insult. He could have at that moment overthrown the government with just, a snap of his fingers, but he didn't, because he had a larger purpose, and that purpose was to save the world. Now, our purpose then here for the readers of 1 Peter is to understand that when they suffered unjustly, people would see this same Christ-like attitude, and it would point them to God the Father. Now, in terms of applying this to our lives, it's actually quite simple to understand, but it's difficult to do in practice, because many people have jobs, and many people feel like they're treated unfairly by their bosses or by their coworkers, that they're devalued, or in some cases, even like emotionally or financially abused. And that's a difficult position to be in, isn't it? And what Peter is saying is, if you get yourself into that position, rather than threaten, rather than insult, rather than revile, you should suffer like Jesus suffered, because it will be a testimony to those around you. Now, the one difference between the first century world and our world, the difference between the first century world and our world is simple. It's this, that the servants didn't have a choice. They had to obey their masters, or it could have been a serious consequence, maybe even death. But you and I have a choice, because we live in a modern culture. And so if you don't like your job, or if for some reason you feel like your boss is mistreating you, or devaluing you, or even asking you to do something that's against the law of God, well, of course, you can leave your job. You have that freedom. Now, maybe you're not in a position to do that, and if you're not in a position to do that, then what he's saying is submit to your boss, even if you're mistreated, because it may be a way of reaching the people around you. And by the way, great resource. If you are sort of frustrated with your job and your work, there's a great book that I can recommend. I believe it's called 48 Days to the Work You Love. It's by Dan Miller, and highly recommended. Lots of great 5-star reviews. But if you're kind of like, I need to do something else, I think that's an option here. Okay, so in the meantime, workers, submit to your bosses until you can find something different potentially. But most importantly, the conduct and the way that you live, especially in the workplace, reflects on God, and it could lead other people to Jesus. Well, I hope that helps for this section. I'm going to come back hopefully tomorrow and do the third section, which is, even more controversial, which is wives and husbands, and the idea of wives submitting to their husbands. That will be a good one. Check that one out tomorrow. Thanks.